afternoon, 29 minutes past 12, with Geoffrey Boot, MHK, today. Mr. Boot, where do you personally and the department stand on the growing of cannabis and hemp?
Well, there's some confusion over hemp, recreational cannabis and medical cannabis. Cannabis for medical and recreational use are more of an industrial process than an agricultural process. Hemp, on the other hand, is something that used to be grown on the island, and that can be grown outdoors and is more of an agricultural process. Obviously, there is an ongoing debate. We had a large consultation. I think 5,500 people responded to that in terms of medical cannabis. I have no problems with medical cannabis and bringing in proper regulation on the island. That there could be a good business opportunity there. When it comes to recreational cannabis, the jury's out. Some countries have legalized it. Some are obviously not doing that, and there are arguments on both sides. When it comes to hemp, if people want to grow hemp, I personally have no problem with that. That's not an active substance type agricultural product, but from an island perspective, it's a matter of how do you process hemp on the island? It's going to be a small amount, and to process hemp properly for building materials, rope or whatever, requires a facility, and I suspect the economics of producing it on island, other than small-scale local use, having to ship it off for proper processing will make it a non-starter.
Taking a look at the accounts, as it were, for environment, food and agriculture, your department costs money. It doesn't generate that much more money. I mean, gross income 3.8 million, gross expenditure 20.6, so net expenditure 16.7. Just explain that in lay terms. What does that mean?
Well, we obviously have an income from things like planning, building control, and various licensing regimes. But we are also responsible for administering the agricultural subsidies and environmental subsidies that go along with that. We are, in essence, the largest regulatory hub within DEFO. We have health and safety, environmental health, planning, building control, among other things, and the Office of Fair Trading. So a lot of that is a regulatory function, costs money rather than recovers money. So there's a lot going on in terms of forestry, the sawmill. We administer the wildlife park. All these things tend to cost money whilst generating some income, but in a lot of cases not generating sufficient income to stand on their own 2 feet.
Obviously, in terms of, we were talking about the fishing industry as well, and the farming industry, but let's get this straight. They aren't economic engines of the Isle of Man. However, they provide the character for the Isle of Man. Our farmers are custodians of the landscape and of the soil, but of course other industries generate much more money. So where does farming and the fishing industry sit, do you think, in the Isle of Man?
Well, in terms of GDP, if you look at fishing, agriculture, value added through our food producers, we generate probably around £100 million a year, and that's circular money. Most of it's sticky; it stays in the economy. But as you rightly point out, agriculture and the environment go hand in hand, and we have all-island biosphere status. And when we look out of the window here or we drive around the island, the countryside looks the way it does because, as you rightly point out, the farmers are the custodians and they mould the countryside. We've recently launched a new agri-environment scheme which will encourage environmental improvements through the farming community, and I think that's it's going to be a great thing going forward. From the fishing side, the marine side, we have 10 marine nature reserves now, and there's a lot going on there which we contribute to in terms of regulating what goes on. And what goes on under the sea is sometimes not quite apparent, but if you look at our climate change agenda, there is a lot of carbon sequestration in our seas, and of course the forestry offering is also key to the environment and climate change and biosphere. So lots and lots going on, and I should mention the upland areas where we have a lot of peatland. Our upland estate is 20,000 plus acres, and part of climate change strategy will be to restore some of the peatland, initially 1,000 acres, and that's very important.
And the peatland stores an enormous amount of carbon dioxide, doesn't it?
It does indeed, and that's why it's so important that either we preserve what we've got or start rebuilding some of the peatland that has been damaged over the years.
You've been around farming all your life, haven't you? With the farming in the family as well. How much have you seen? Because obviously you've seen farming change over generations and over decades. How easy is it for farmers to make a living nowadays?
Well, it's not easy. People seem to think that farmers live in luxury and ride around in Range Rovers. The reality is we commissioned some work at the beginning of my administration, as it were, to look at the profitability of Manx farms versus the subsidy that they receive. And if we remove the subsidy, a lot of Manx farms would simply not be profitable businesses. In other words,
go bust.
They would go bust, or they wouldn't be making a living. They would have to be subsidised, and a lot of farmers subsidise their farming income from other sources. Anyone who watches Country File on Sunday yesterday will have seen that it's a similar scenario in the UK, with a lot of farms being very marginal. And we have to be aware of that, because at the moment we don't pay farmers, apart from their subsidy, to look after the countryside. They operate businesses there. But if we remove that profitability and farms become unviable, then there may be a situation where we will have to pay for the environmental measures going forward to keep the Manx countryside looking the way it does.
And making family farms sustainable, because, and again, this is an oft-quoted story, the sons and daughters of farmers can earn 30, 35, 40,000 in the finance industry. Why should they get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to milk cows?
That is the essence of the problem. And if you look at the cost of food in Europe and the Isle of Man, we actually pay a lot less for our food than its real value. And I hate to say that, but if you look at the effort that farmers put in, my neighbour's milking herd, they're up and having to milk twice a day. They don't go on holiday. The animals require attention all the time, and it's a dedication rather than just a career. And I know from my own experience over the years, a lot of youngsters don't stick with the farming.
Okay. Could you please ask Mr. Boot what's happening to planning appeals? There seems to be an extraordinary delay, some taking 6 months for a decision.
Planning appeals were held up during the COVID crisis, and we accumulated, I think, a backlog of 28. Since then, we started to clear that, and from my perspective, when they land on my desk, I turn them around generally within 48 hours. But there's an administrative process around dealing with a planning appeal that involves an inspector, him preparing a report, the administration that goes to getting the report to me, and then consideration afterwards. I think the backlog is nowhere near as bad as some people portray. There are some applications that have been very complex and have required detailed consideration and evidence from other parties. But at the moment, we have a system where the appeal inspectors have been able to come to the island. But once again, now that the UK has gone into semi-lockdown, they have been advised not to come to the island. So we are trying to devise a methodology of using virtual visits to sites, but the inspectors have to be satisfied that the person actually walking around with the camera is looking at the bits and pieces that they want to look at, and be sure that they've seen the whole picture.
You mentioned earlier on that planning is by its very nature adversarial, and obviously a decision has to be made one way or the other. How do you personally tiptoe through the minefield?
Well, it's not about tiptoeing. I think when an appeal lands on my desk, I look at the inspector's report, I look at the planning background, and I look at the policy that's applied and how it's been applied. And then there's a balance. It's always subjective. It's never, planning is a subjective matter, and it's never quite as black and white as some would think. Sometimes you can make a decision very easily, and based on the planning policy, it's obviously against planning policy, but other times, people don't usually make applications that have no merit. So you have to be careful that you look at the merit of the application and the application of policy.
You must have heard many times, rich people get planning, poor people wait forever.
Certainly from my perspective, I deal with all applications evenly and or even-handed, and I think the planning officers do that as well. I think there is a perception there because some individuals do get larger prominent housing, that somehow they have priority, but the vast majority of applications for what I call normal household extensions, etc., go through the system very quickly, and they don't attract a lot of attention, so they don't have a profile.
How do you feel about, in the future, solar panels not requiring planning permission?
I think in certain circumstances that they should be permitted development. It seems a no-brainer to me. If we're going down the climate change agenda that we are, we should encourage people to obviously take advantage of the technology available.
Would Mr. Boot be in favour of opening the island's bigger reservoirs to public access for kayaks?
It's not a decision for me in terms of we don't actually operate, or we do operate some of the reservoirs, but the biggest reservoir is obviously owned by MU, and I think there may be issues around potential pollution. When it comes to the reservoirs that we stock for fishing, etc., there is always some conflict between kayaking and fishing activity, recreational activity generally. There are vast amounts of inshore waters available to kayakers around the island, and at the moment, as far as I'm aware, there is no great demand for inland waterways to be used for kayaking.
Okay, a note in from Andy and said, could you ask Mr. Boot, in June 2019, the Chief Minister committed to the planting of 85,000 trees by 2024. How many have we planted to date?
The site is prepared, and the first trees will be going in the new year.
Whereabouts is it?
It's down at Miriveg. So it's a large site. It's taken some preparation. We've been obviously working on the logistics of the amount of trees required, but I'm sure we will have those trees planted before then.
Do we know what trees are they?
They'll be broadleaf type species that are indigenous to the island.
Okay, Thelma, as soon as Thelma knew that you were coming on, Thelma is our bee enthusiast minister, and she wants to know the health of the island's bee population.
Well, the bee population on the island is, by all accounts, very healthy. I used to keep bees in my younger years, so I do know a bit about bee diseases, but not what they're called.
Could you tell me, why did you keep bees?
I like honey. But no, it was a small business of mine when I was a youngster, and people used to sort of give me a small stipend for putting a hive in various strategic positions. But bee health on the Isle of Man is good. We're well separated from other land masses. I think we're nearest for 29 kilometres, 30 kilometres, and bees generally only fly about 10 or 11 kilometres. So we want to maintain that status. We have obviously a moratorium on importing bees and bee products and equipment that's used to make sure that we don't import disease.
Is it the Varroa mite, I think it is?
I think you are correct in that, yes.
But of course, again, bees are humble beings. As you say, we love the honey and we love the beeswax. And if we don't have bees, everything will die in years, won't it? In years to come. Well,
bees are an important part of our ecology.
Fundamental.
Insects and bees, they pollinate everything, and it's important that we keep them. So from an island perspective, we want to keep our bee population as healthy as we possibly can. And I think the beekeeping community are as aware of that as anyone, and they are our eyes and ears.
If you want to get in touch with Geoffrey Boot, MHK, the Environment, Food and Agriculture Minister, we've got loads and loads of texts and emails. And if you want to call 66 13 68.